Hey everybody, that time again for class to get going. Let's see. Oh, I did notice a typo in our scheduled due dates. Nothing to worry about at this juncture, but I will fix it and reprint that out for you. So let's see. We're still basically in chapter 1. Plan this week is to wrap up. Well, chapter 1 should definitely wrap up today, and then start chapter 2 on Wednesday. So if you would at least have gotten started on chapter 2. The quiz for that chapter isn't due until next week, but it's the kind of same cycle that we'll be doing the whole semester. Do about a chapter a week. Do a quiz out the next week, that kind of thing. I feel like I'm forgetting something, but I'll probably come back later. Any general questions before I jump into things? Yeah.
I was looking at the assignments tab, and it says assignments week 1 do 30 points, and week 2 do 30 points.
Yep.
But it doesn't say like what it's for.
Oh yeah. Each of these in-class assignments that we do is worth 10 points, right? So a week's worth is usually 3 days, unless there's a holiday or something. And then I put that in at the end of that week. So the stuff that you've turned in last class, I've looked through it in graded because I kind of do that in class, but then I don't put it in the graded book until we're all done. All right? Good question. Any other questions? All right. So where we left off last time, we were talking about some kind of larger conceptual things when it comes to geography, such as perception of place, how we perceive of places, right? And these perceptions can be colored a lot by media, right? Social media, books, TV shows, movies. So for example, when I travel internationally, whenever you travel, one of the first things people ask is where you're from. And the only real kind of movie people remember connected to Minnesota isn't The Mighty Ducks, although filmed here, or Grumpy Old Men, which is also filmed here. They think of Fargo, which isn't really that Minnesotan, but that's what people think. People seen Fargo and know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. They have some thick Minnesotan accents in that movie, we'll put it that way. I can't think of too much else that is supposed to be depicting Minnesota. Do people have any kind of if you think about different places in the world that you haven't been, or maybe that you have, are there any movies that comes to mind that's like, oh, this is how I picture this place?
Arizona?
What movie?
I don't know specific movies, but if it's like Western, like country Western related, like stuff that my grandma would watch, then I connect it to Arizona or Texas like automatically.
Sure.
Sicario.
What's that?
Sicario from Mexico.
Okay. It's interesting. Very often, people will talk about different crime dramas, or for New Mexico, they'll say Breaking Bad, which is supposed to take place in New Mexico. I don't know if Breaking Bad is an accurate representation of what everyone's life is like in New Mexico, but I haven't been there, so maybe it is. That's the kind of thing that's held in our minds. Like maybe the place is like what we've seen. Has anyone ever seen like a Bollywood movie? Bollywood? So,
Professor, isn't that just being stereotypical though? Like I perceive Minnesotans as having bigger jackets than the rest of the United States because it's colder, and that would be like a natural perception because it's much colder here than it is anywhere else.
mm-hmm.
But I just look at them as people who are backward, and it doesn't add up. Like I feel like at a point you have to draw the line between stereotypes and actual conceivable perception.
I feel like we have like subconscious stereotypes of like certain places. I don't think it's like naturally like cause harm or anything, but it's like I said, like I've never been to Texas or Arizona, but I'm like subconsciously connected to that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's that, but it's just like subconsciously that we see that as like a generalization because of what we perceived it or seen it as.
Yeah, the book talks about how we have preconceived ideas of what the world is like, And the book talks about how that's scaffolding to when we research and we find out new things, right? One of the biggest ways, of course, is doing field work. When geographers go to a place, right? And they look and they talk to people, and then they try to say, well, how is this different than the representation that was in my mind from a movie or something, which obviously often do have stereotypes, right? This book is talking a lot about, well, confronting those ideas of what we got from TVs and movies and saying, what is the reality on the ground, right? That's one of the reasons why I try to travel as much as possible, because I have a strong sense that you can read a lot about a place, but until you're kind of on the ground, and even when you're on the ground, you often don't get a true sense of what a place is like, because you'll get maybe a specific tourist package of a place, right? And people will be kind of performing their local culture, but not in a way that people actually live in their day-to-day lives, right? So perception of place versus reality, but we do need to keep in mind that perceptions of places will often kind of color those places, because let's stick to the example of tourism. Tourists will want specific experiences when they're going someplace, right? And places will kind of try to lean into that. So in the United States, for example, the tourist and museum industry, well, if you're going to California as a tourist, it kind of knows what you want to look for, right? Like Old West things, and it will kind of amp up that stuff. The Mall of America here in Minnesota, well, y'all are pretty young, but when it first went in, do you remember when there was Camp Snoopy in the middle, right? Well, actually, when we get to that region, I'll have a whole lecture that'll talk about it. But originally, they were trying to make the center of the Mall of America look like a Minnesota wild area. So they're using plants and trees that were locally and architectural styles that were similar to local styles. But what happened was, although it was popular to go to the Mall of America and to Camp Snoopy, through time they realized that people weren't really coming to the mall for that feeling. And they've actually changed over to tropical varieties of plants, which are often actually easier to take care of indoors. And more of an international style of architecture and how they design the rides and things. But the rides all used to be specifically tied to specific things in Minnesota history. There was a mining ride, because we have a big history of mining ore here. There was a lumber ride, right, where you're riding down the chute with lumber. And they used to actually have all these old implements that they got from I don't know where, but like they're trying to give a real Minnesota sense of the place. But again, it was packaged for tourism. So how Minnesotan was it? They kind of gave up on that and moved on to other things. Well, anyway, like I said, I'll do a whole lecture on that when we get to the area. Okay. Sense of place. Infusing a place with meaning as a result of experiencing a place. Right? So that would be something like, when you talk about home, obviously a different person is going to have a different picture of what that means, right? So we all have different homes. There, of course, are similarities, but tons of differences, and it will have a specific connection to you. Like a place that will have a perception, but also maybe a different reality on the ground would be a cemetery, right? You see horror movies, you think of cemeteries as a certain thing. You actually go to a cemetery, it's quite sedate, not as startling or scary, right? Things like that. All right, we'll keep going. We'd already talked about a number of toponyms, which are how places change their names and try to often pick names that will evoke a certain type of idea, and then often cities in a way to kind of sell themselves. Well, they will use architecture that are kind of what people expect. Actually, I think I'm gonna turn off a couple of these lights because it's a bit bright and it's washing out my slides. I'm gonna go back a couple just to remind you about toponyms. Remember winter place in Colorado, right? Wanted to evoke a certain type of image for tourists. All right, just a couple examples. So when this book is splitting up the chapters on regions, I showed you before some maps looking at different ways different geographers decided where different regions are. This book looks at historical spatial interaction, right? What places historically have been more connected, because it's not all about lines on a map, right? It's not actually about absolute distances from each other. Places can become relatively more close to each other through interaction, trade, and things like that. Physical processes, like some places will share a general similar climate, and that could make for similar aspects to their culture. Also shared cultural processes. So something like language, right? Now usually when you see large areas that have one language, very often that's evidence that either there's a current kind of empire around that area, or there's a past empire. Very often a long dead empire that no one remembers anymore, but they made everyone convert to the same language and religion and different things, different cultural norms, so that legacy will still be there, even if the empire itself is just long gone. As I said, spatial interaction, so places can be relatively closer to each other just because they're interacting a lot more. There are things like absolute distance, but connectivity, which is a term that we'll come to use a lot in this text, connectivity between places can really tie them together. Also accessibility, so there are a lot of natural divides between places that have through long periods of time, because they've divided places, they have been a barrier between cultures and norms and things. And those, of course, become more or less difficult to kind of traverse through time. So example, very often you would have a mountain that would be a barrier between peoples, and so you'd have cultures that could be relatively near each other, but evolve in different ways, right? Have very different norms and things. Or something like a big desert, right? A big desert, what that means is historically, since less people have traveled across here, although there are trade networks and things, you'll often have different kind of cultural norms on each side of that big barrier, whether it's a desert, an ocean, a mountain. You know, usually you have mountains that separate countries, and these are because of, well, historically they're difficult to traverse. Another term from the text, time, distance, decay. The likelihood of a trait or innovation diffusing decreases the farther away in time or distance it moves from its origin. So when we say further away in time and distance, well, when it comes to travel, you know, for most of human existence, people traveled on their feet, right? And if you watch old movies, everyone has a horse. That wasn't actually the case. Not everyone had a horse. People were mostly going around on their feet. And so what that meant was cities were much smaller, right? Travel distances, trade routes, a lot of these things had to kind of take that into consideration. Old movies or TV shows that take place in ancient times, they'll have everyone on a horse because it helps in their story writing. Because otherwise it takes forever for characters to meet each other. But that's again one of those kind of ways we can kind of misperceive what realities were. So diffusion. Geography talks a lot about diffusion. And I'm sure past couple of years, you've probably seen a lot of news stories mostly focusing on how diseases diffuse. And diseases do indeed move about, but similar to other things like languages, religions, ideas, technologies, places that are more interconnected, those things can travel more quickly. So if you have trade routes that are connecting people, you could have a plague pass through that area and kind of skip over areas that are just outside of that. So places even in ancient times were relatively closer to each other. Actually, in the first days of COVID in the US, do people remember what areas were like kind of first strongly affected within the US.
Western Washington,
What's that?
Western Washington, California, better.
Mm,
New York. Now why were they affected first?
because it's like major tourism, like going back and forth to those countries, or?
And they're travel hubs, right? They're major travel hubs. You got major airports that are located, and mostly because those economies are really strong, right? You got a lot of people who want to go to New York. You got a lot of people who want to go to California, Seattle, Washington, right? So these are main travel hubs. In Europe, if you remember the news at the time, there was a lot of cases that happened in Italy all of a sudden, right? And it's like, well, why Italy compared to other places? Well, Italy was having some specific trade with the area within China, right? It all kind of depended on how every place was interconnected. Hearth, place of origin, right? Everything started somewhere, right? Even if that's lost. So for example, when the text looks at the history of the invention of agriculture, it's tough to pinpoint exactly the time and place, right? Because it was a pretty generalized invention, and it seemed to also happen in multiple places, just different time frames. So different inventions and things, kind of depends. Modern day, we could trace back things a bit better than we used to be able to, but again, not perfectly. So as I said, every cultural trait began somewhere, right? So the Indo-European language group, it's a very large language group, but the hypothesis is it started near the Caspian Sea. Very often, these different things, cultural norms or ideas or religions or languages, sometimes they actually die out in the place that they came from, right? Especially the case in lots of religions. Religions and how they move about the earth is much more of a flow than you might realize, because, you know, you gotta look at it through grand scopes of time. World languages. And you can see some of these are somewhat similar to different national boundaries. As I said before, very often these are signs of past empires, or sometimes current empires, depending on which, because empires usually, well, when they take over areas, they tend to force people within those areas to assimilate to that empire's central norms. We'll talk all about empires and stuff more as we go. World religions, another trait that often the dividing lines were similar to different empires, right? But not always. All right, diffusion, right? We've been talking about this whole time. Diffusion, just how things move about. But diffusion happens in a number of different ways. Right? Contagious diffusion, contagious being a good word. Again, you could picture a disease, but this connects to anything that really moves around. So contagious diffusion, ideas spread from hearth to nearby areas without skipping over people and places. So for example, you have a center point where like there's an idea for something, right? And it just kind of spreads evenly because people are just spreading that idea. Hierarchical diffusion. Ideas spread from most important places to the next important places, skipping over people and places in between. So when we were talking about the early days of COVID, right? Well, it was a bit hierarchical because it was travel hubs first. It seemed to almost skip over different populations, right? Eventually we got contagious diffusion and it just kind of went everywhere else, right? But at first it was only certain places. Example the text uses looking at expansion diffusion. Well, it looks at Starbucks, but Starbucks diffuses in multiple ways, right? Hierarchically and contagiously. Let's see, I think I got a map. Oh, the first Starbucks, 1971, Seattle, Washington. Worldwide Starbucks locations. So again, the company itself would try to start up businesses in large cities that had, lots of good money. But through time also just people who liked Starbucks, who didn't necessarily live in large cities, would want to open up stores in smaller cities and places that were maybe not on travel hubs. So this is the current kind of Starbucks world empire right now. Another diffusion, relocation diffusion, right? Sometimes people themselves move to a place, and then when they move, well, if they don't immediately assimilate to what the culture and norms are in the place they go to, they will bring their culture and norms with them, right? And the earth is covered in history of migration of populations all over the place, bringing a lot of their norms. But again, a lot of these things, they use the Spanish language. A lot of these are legacies of past empires too, right? Globalization, I know a lot of these terms are pretty simple. It's one of those things where it's like, well, it's the first chapter of the book, so they're gonna like just give you all the basics. So you probably have had this term before in the classes. Processes, heightening interactions, increasing interdependence, and deepening relations across country boundaries, right? Globalization. And there are a couple of dates when it looks at globalization. The next couple chapters will go more in depth into analysis of this. But basically through time, most geographers would say that the speed at which the world has become interdependent and interconnected, in general, it's increasing through time. I know during the pandemic, it feels like that's all been shut off. But of course, we still have the internet. We're still interconnected in a lot more ways than just people moving around. Talks about the Columbian Exchange here. What that basically means is beginning around 1500, you had the exchange of, well, obviously diseases, but also people, animals, crops. Some of the main things that really influenced the world was the diffusion of a lot of these crops in agriculture, because it allowed a lot of different vegetation to adapt to lots of different climates. Civilizations, major civilizations in ancient times. This is another term that actually we'll be coming back to in the next chapter and the chapter after, as far as civilizations, even defining like, well, what is a civilization? What does that mean when we talk about ancient civilizations? We'll talk about that a bit more. But very often these ancient civilizations, they were central hearths of usually agricultural revolutions that happened independently that did not actually need interconnectivity that people kind of came up with around a similar time frame. World regions, that just kind of repeats what I just said. So these are our big regions in our textbook. And you know, there could be plenty of argument that maybe these aren't ideal or they should be shifted around in different ways. But this is what the textbook has decided for what we're looking at right now. I mentioned earlier, field work is one of the main ways that geographers try to figure out just what's going on in different places, right? And so when you do your research for your midterm paper and your final paper, you'll probably be looking at a lot of field work, right? You might be looking at a specific question, a specific issue. A lot of people do problem papers or case studies where we look at some problem somewhere and what people try to do to solve it and what's going on in that place that would either help or hinder the solution of that problem. I also talked about this a bit earlier too, cartography, the art and science of map making. Let's see, when it comes to maps, there's two main types, reference maps and thematic maps. Reference maps show absolute locations, thematic maps show relative locations. What does that mean? Well, if you have a map of capitals of countries of the world, well, that map is going to have very specific things, right? It's going to be like, well, there's capital right there, there's capital there, right? Very specific, very simple. Map's not gonna show you everything in the world. It's gonna show you what you need to know for the kind of question it wants to answer. Population density, this is more of a thematic map, right? Definitely there's data shown in this map at specific places, but it's less kind of resolute, right? It's more like we could see in general where there's some large population clusters, right? Usually populations are clustered around areas that historically had really great agriculture, really good agricultural land, but not always. There's plenty of people who are moving out to, like, for example, desert areas, United States, the Sun Belt, a lot of people moving there, because it's nice, right? Cartography, as I mentioned, it's art and science of map making. Projection, one of the terms in this chapter. Projection, I mentioned this first day, but that's the reason why maps look different, right? So you're taking something that's round and you're trying to make it flat, and so when you do that, you're gonna have problems. And when you're making your map, you just gotta decide which problems are okay and which problems aren't, right? So you could have a Mercator projection that shows the correct shapes of every place, but they're not the right sizes, but they're the right shapes, right? And then you have Peter's projection. Everything is actually the right size, but if you're gonna have everything the right size, you can't have it be the right shape, right? Unless it's on a globe. GIS, remote sensing, a lot of the remote sensing that is used these days is satellite data, but increasingly they're using drones. Our GIS department here is using a lot of drones for mapping purposes. Cultural landscape, term that this chapter started off with and it comes back to at the end. Cultural landscape sounds like kind of a big vague term, but it's visible human imprint on the landscape. Right? Visible human imprint on the landscape. So what that could mean is obviously something like this that has definitely had some human imprint. The chapter talks about the African Rift Valley. The African Rift Valley is, of course, well, there's tectonic plates that are pulling apart within Africa, and at this point it's pulling apart and it's created a number of large lakes, but in millions and millions of years as that process continues, that will become an ocean and that will connect with the rest of the ocean. Well, you look at a place like this and you think of natural processes, you don't really probably think of the human impact, but large areas of the Earth's surface are not in their absolute natural state. Lots of areas have grazing land that used to be forested. Lots of places in the US is actually a bad example. So humans have had effect on landscapes that often appear very natural. Just a map of the Rift Valley. Boy, these lights just wash out the colors. So this area is pulling apart right now. We don't really dig into plate tectonics until I think the last 2 chapters of the text, so. This chapter ends talking about, well, how the cultural landscape, when we look at it, we'll often think about what's going on there now that has a cultural influence. But of course, every place has a history, and there have been humans on the earth for, you know, a super long time, right? And so you can have areas that have multiple different historical time frames of impact on the land. Like, well, when I went to Portugal, what often happens when I travel to Europe, they will be putting in like maybe a subway expansion, or they'll just be fixing some plumbing, and they'll come across some giant Roman ruins, right? That are thousands of years old. And sometimes they'll excavate those, and sometimes they'll just leave them because they want to put through their subway or something. So there's history all around us, right? This area actually was kind of controversial recently. People ever been over here? This part, Dings Bluffs? Well, there's a number of hiking trails over here, but recently the city has started basically putting up fences and stopping access to a number of the hiking trails because they want to be more respectful to, well, what this area was historically. A little bit of local controversy finishes out this chapter. Well, that's quicker than I thought, but that's okay. Any questions about this chapter? Well, I could start talking about the next chapter, but I know no one's read anything about it yet. So this will just give us a little extra time to work on some questions. Gonna have you work on questions again. Same thing as last time, but it'll be larger groups. Couple things before you all get moving into your groups. Because they're larger groups, you should reintroduce yourselves because there should be people in your group who weren't in your group before. Also, on these questions, I graded pretty easy on the last one. Try to put in more specifics. So when you're writing down an answer to a question, you know, let's say the question is, I don't know, like, where's the Mall of America, right? And if you answer, you know, it's in the place by the thing. Now in your mind, you think you're being specific, but you know you're not, right? So this time, try to lean on being more specific. And again, finish these answers. 4 questions I'll have you work on. You bring them up here, I'll grade it right away. If something's wrong or needs more info, I'll just let you know and you can fix it and still get full points. If you know you have a brilliant group and you just answered all right and you're all done quick, you could go a little early today. All right, self-assemble, groups of 6 to 7 per group, bigger groups. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, is in general. All right. Well, we still do the answers in tournament. Yeah. No, but okay. Yeah, you can just do the questions. Email me again, Leah, and I'll send you which questions they were. And then you just email them to me or bring them in the classroom.
Yeah. So I'm tournaments.
Yeah, if you're going
Did you want to write them down? Sure. I don't know, I just wasn't sure. And do we want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Caroline.
I'm Consuelo.
I'm Tanner.
And brother.
You write your name and then pass it down.
Oh, okay.
Page 34.
Um,